The roar of engines echoed through Thunder Valley Speedway like mechanical thunder, drowning out everything except the collective heartbeat of 15,000 spectators. But in that deafening chaos of the 2018 National Youth Motocross Championships, 17-year-old Jake Morrison simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only his helmet and a mystery that would haunt a small Texas town for years. Before we dive into this mystery, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this story. Saturday morning had started like any other race day for the Morrison family. The smell of bacon grease mixed with motor oil filled their modest kitchen as Jake's mother, Sarah, packed his lucky pre-race sandwich, peanut butter and strawberry jam, crusts cut off, just like she'd done for every competition since he was 8 years old. His father, Tom, stood in the garage, methodically checking tire pressure one final time, the familiar ritual that had become their sacred bond. Jake had been riding since he could barely reach the handlebars. The kid who was too shy to order his own food at restaurants transformed into a fearless competitor the moment he mounted his dirt bike. His bright orange KTM 250, number 47, his lucky number, gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the garage. The machine represented 3 years of overtime shifts at the auto plant, every penny saved for his son's dream of going pro. "You ready for this, champ?" Tom had asked, his calloused hands adjusting Jake's chest protector for the 100th time. Jake's green eyes sparkled with the kind of confidence only 17-year-olds possess. "Dad, I was born ready." Those would be the last words Tom Morrison would ever hear his son speak. The Thunder Valley track was notorious among riders, a brutal 2.3-mile circuit of jumps, berms, and whoops that separated the champions from the wannabes. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly as riders lined up for the qualifying heats. Jake was positioned in the third row, his orange bike standing out like a flame against the sea of competitors. At exactly 2:47 p.m., the starting gate dropped. 36 riders launched forward in a cloud of dust and determination. Jake shot out clean, threading through the pack with the grace of someone born to ride. Spectators in the bleachers could see him gaining positions, his signature aggressive style pushing him toward the top 10. But somewhere between the rhythm section and the final tabletop jump, something went terribly wrong. When the checkered flag waved 12 minutes later, 35 riders crossed the finish line. Jake Morrison wasn't among them. His abandoned KTM was found 20 yards off the track, engine still warm, kickstand down, as if he'd simply decided to take a casual stroll. His helmet lay nearby, chin strap unbuckled. But Jake himself had vanished completely, as if the earth had simply swallowed him whole. The initial search was massive. Helicopters circling overhead, K9 units combing every inch of the surrounding desert, volunteers walking arm in arm through the scrubland until darkness forced them home. For 3 weeks, Jake Morrison's face stared back from every telephone pole and storefront window in a 50-mile radius. Then the case went cold. But 5 years later, a single discovery would prove that Jake Morrison's disappearance was just the beginning of something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The fluorescent lights of the Thunder Valley Security Office buzzed like angry wasps as Sheriff David Holt stared at the grainy surveillance footage for the 100th time. Frame by frame, he watched Jake Morrison's orange bike navigate the track's treacherous terrain, the teenager's form perfect as he attacked each jump with calculated precision. Then, at timestamp 2:52:33, something impossible happened. The camera showed Jake approaching turn 7, leaning into the corner with textbook form. In the next frame, captured just 3 seconds later, his bike sat empty beside the track, kickstand deployed, engine idling peacefully. But Jake Morrison had simply ceased to exist. Detective Maria Santos arrived from Austin that evening, her boots crunching on the gravel parking lot still littered with abandoned race programs and empty soda cups. The festival atmosphere from hours earlier had evaporated, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the distant hum of emergency generators powering the searchlights. She'd worked missing persons cases for 12 years, but something about this one felt different. Wrong in a way that made her seasoned instincts scream warnings. The initial search grid expanded like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Teams of volunteers, their flashlight beams cutting through the desert darkness, combed through mesquite brush and rocky outcroppings that surrounded the speedway. The terrain was unforgiving, a maze of arroyos and limestone cliffs where rattlesnakes sought shade and javelinas roamed in small, dangerous packs. Sarah Morrison had collapsed twice during the first night, her body finally surrendering to the adrenaline that had kept her upright through the initial shock. Tom paced the command tent like a caged animal, his mechanic's hands opening and closing reflexively as if he could somehow fix this problem the way he fixed everything else in his life. The couple who had shared 23 years of marriage found themselves speaking in whispers, afraid that raising their voices might somehow make their nightmare more real. By the third day, the search had attracted media attention from across the state. News vans lined the access road, their satellite dishes reaching toward a cloudless sky like mechanical flowers seeking sun. Jake's senior photo, the one where he smiled shyly at the camera, his green eyes bright with possibility, flashed across television screens from Dallas to Houston. But the desert kept its secrets. Search dogs followed dozens of scent trails that led nowhere. The canines would track with enthusiasm for 50 or 100 yards, then stop abruptly, sitting and whining as if Jake's scent had simply vanished into the air. Helicopter crews reported no unusual activity, no disturbed ground, no signs of struggle or violence. It was as if the teenager had been carefully erased from existence by some unseen hand. The strangest detail emerged during the bike examination. Jake's KTM showed no signs of mechanical failure, no evidence of a crash that might have thrown him from the machine. More puzzling still, the kickstand had been deliberately deployed, a conscious action that suggested Jake had stopped intentionally, not been thrown or knocked unconscious. His helmet, found exactly 18 feet from the bike, bore no impact damage despite being unbuckled and removed. Detective Santos interviewed every rider who had been on the track that day. Their stories painted a consistent picture. Jake had been riding well, holding his position in the middle of the pack, showing no signs of distress or mechanical problems. Several riders remembered seeing his distinctive orange bike approaching the turn where he would disappear, but none could recall seeing him after that moment. Racing official Marcus Webb, a 30-year veteran of motocross events, provided the most haunting testimony. He'd been stationed at Turn 7, the exact location where Jake vanished, supposedly watching for safety violations and track conditions. But when investigators pressed him for details about those crucial minutes, Webb's memory became frustratingly vague. "Things happen fast out there," he kept repeating, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he lit another cigarette. "Dust everywhere, bikes coming and going. Hard to keep track of every single rider." As the second week stretched into a third, the massive search operation slowly wound down. Volunteer numbers dwindled as people returned to their normal lives, leaving behind only the most dedicated searchers and the Morrison family's desperate hope. The media convoy dispersed to cover fresher tragedies, and Jake Morrison's disappearance began its inevitable fade from public consciousness. But Detective Santos couldn't let go. Something about the scene nagged at her, a detail that felt important but remained frustratingly out of reach. She walked the track at dawn, retracing Jake's route, studying the terrain with the methodical patience of a hunter. The morning light revealed details invisible during the chaotic search. Tire tracks that didn't quite match the race patterns, disturbed vegetation that seemed deliberately arranged rather than naturally scattered. On her final official day on the case, Santos made a discovery that would haunt her dreams for years to come. Hidden beneath a low-growing creosote bush, nearly invisible unless viewed from exactly the right angle, she found a single muddy boot print, size 12, with a distinctive wear pattern on the heel. The print was fresh, no more than a day or two old, and it pointed directly away from the track toward the deepest, most remote section of the desert. But when she returned the next morning with casting equipment and a photography team, the print was gone, erased as completely and mysteriously as Jake Morrison himself. The Morrison house had become a shrine to frozen time. Jake's bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it that Saturday morning. Racing posters covering every inch of wall space, trophies gleaming on dusty shelves, and his backup gear hanging in the closet like the armor of a fallen knight. Sarah had stopped dusting the room after the second year, unable to bear disturbing even the smallest detail of her son's presence. Tom had aged decades in the 5 years since Jake's disappearance. His once powerful frame had withered, and his hands, those same hands that had lovingly maintained every bolt on Jake's racing bikes, now shook with a tremor that no amount of beer could steady. He'd returned to work at the auto plant exactly 3 months after the search ended, mechanically performing the same tasks that had once provided purpose and pride. But his co-workers learned quickly to avoid meeting his eyes, which held a hollow emptiness that made everyone uncomfortable. The couple's marriage had become a careful dance around the crater that Jake's absence had carved through their lives. They spoke in practical terms about groceries and bills, avoided Jake's favorite restaurants, and never, ever discussed the future. Sarah had thrown herself into volunteer work at the local missing children's organization, channeling her grief into helping other families navigate the bureaucratic maze of law enforcement and media attention. Tom had chosen the opposite path, retreating into an isolation so complete that even their closest friends had stopped trying to break through. Detective Santos had never officially closed the case, but departmental pressure and a lack of leads had forced her to move on to more recent investigations. Still, she kept Jake's file in her desk drawer, pulling it out during quiet moments to review the evidence photos and witness statements. The case had become her white whale, the one that got away, the puzzle she couldn't solve despite years of experience and intuition that rarely failed her. The annual MotoCross championships had continued at Thunder Valley, though attendance had never fully recovered from the shadow cast by Jake's disappearance. Racing officials had installed additional security cameras and implemented new safety protocols, but riders still whispered about the cursed turn where the Morrison kid had vanished. Some claimed to see ghostly glimpses of an orange bike in their peripheral vision, especially during evening practice sessions when the desert light played tricks on tired eyes. Marcus Webb, the race official who had been stationed at Turn 7, had quit his position just 6 months after Jake's disappearance. He'd moved to New Mexico without leaving a forwarding address, telling neighbors he needed a fresh start away from Texas. His sudden departure had raised questions, but with no evidence of wrongdoing, the investigation had nowhere to go. The case had spawned its share of amateur detectives and conspiracy theorists. Online forums buzzed with wild theories about alien abductions, government cover-ups, and secret underground racing circuits. Documentary filmmakers had approached the Morrison family repeatedly, drawn by the mystery's cinematic potential, but Tom and Sarah had refused all requests. Their pain was not entertainment, and Jake's memory deserved better than sensationalized speculation. Local law enforcement had fielded hundreds of tips over the years. Jake spotted in distant cities, living under assumed names, or working at gas stations in remote towns. Each lead had been dutifully investigated and systematically disproven, leaving behind only more disappointment and false hope for parents who had already endured too much of both. The desert around Thunder Valley had become a pilgrimage site of sorts for the morbidly curious. Weekend explorers armed with metal detectors and too much imagination wandered the scrubland, searching for clues that professional investigators had missed. They found nothing but rusted beer cans and the occasional lost tool, but their presence served as a constant reminder to the Morrison family that their private tragedy had become public fascination. Dr. Jennifer Martinez. The family therapist Sarah had started seeing in year 3, often marveled at the different ways people processed unresolved grief. Some families fell apart completely, torn apart by blame and what-if scenarios. Others, like the Morrisons, seemed to crystallize around their loss, becoming harder and more brittle with each passing season. Neither approach was right or wrong. They were simply different survival strategies for navigating the impossible. In quiet moments, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come, Tom found himself replaying that last morning in endless detail. The way Jake had wolfed down his lucky sandwich, talking excitedly about his chances in the qualifying rounds. The brief moment when their eyes had met in the garage mirror, and Jake had grinned that cocky teenager grin that could light up any room. The casual way he'd said goodbye, as if they'd see each other in a few hours for the victory celebration they'd already started planning. Sarah's dreams were filled with phone calls that never came. Jake's voice on the other end, apologetic and embarrassed, explaining where he'd been and why he couldn't come home sooner. She'd wake up reaching for a telephone that hadn't rung, her heart hammering with hope that dissolved like morning mist the moment consciousness returned. Each dream felt real enough to break her heart all over again. The local newspaper ran a small anniversary article each year, usually buried on page 3 unless it was a slow news day. The headline never changed. Jake Morrison still missing after X years. The story would recap the basic facts, include a quote from Sheriff Holt about keeping the case active, and end with a plea for anyone with information to come forward. It was a ritual as predictable and meaningless as most small-town traditions. But time has a way of shifting the landscape, both literally and figuratively. Desert winds reshape sand dunes, expose buried objects, and sometimes reveal secrets that were never meant to stay hidden. And in the spring of 2023, exactly 5 years and 7 months after Jake Morrison vanished, the desert finally began to speak. The metal detector's steady beeping had become white noise to Bobby Carrera after 6 hours of searching the desert floor. As a weekend treasure hunter with more enthusiasm than success, he'd grown accustomed to false alarms, bottle caps, pull tabs, and fragments of rusted metal that promised fortune but delivered only disappointment. But this signal was different, stronger and more consistent than the usual buried trash. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain as Bobby knelt beside a weathered boulder, approximately 2 miles southwest of Thunder Valley Speedway. He'd never ventured this far from the track before, but recent rains had washed away years of accumulated sand and debris, exposing previously buried sections of the desert floor. What he uncovered beneath 18 inches of packed earth would resurrect a case that had been slowly dying in filing cabinets and fading memories. The wheel emerged from the ground like a metallic flower blooming in reverse. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard dirt bike wheel. Aluminum rim, knobby tire, spokes radiating from a central hub. But as Bobby brushed away more soil, details began to emerge that made his pulse quicken and his hands tremble with something beyond excitement. The rim bore distinctive scratches and wear patterns that spoke of serious racing use. More importantly, remnants of bright orange paint clung to several spokes, protected from the elements by their burial beneath the desert floor. But it was the small decal near the valve stem that made Bobby's breath catch in his throat. A faded sticker bearing the number 47, Jake Morrison's racing number. Bobby's first instinct was to call the police immediately, but years of watching crime documentaries had taught him the importance of preserving a potential crime scene. He carefully photographed the wheel from every angle, using his phone to document its exact position and the surrounding area before disturbing anything further. The metallic taste of adrenaline filled his mouth as he realized he might be holding the first real clue in the Jake Morrison case. Sheriff Holt arrived within 20 minutes of Bobby's call, accompanied by Detective Santos, who had never stopped hoping for this exact moment. The crime scene team followed shortly after, their white van looking incongruous against the desert backdrop of sagebrush and rocky outcroppings. Santos approached the site with the careful reverence of an archaeologist uncovering an ancient tomb. The wheel's condition told a story that made everyone at the scene uncomfortable. While the aluminum rim showed expected signs of desert exposure, some corrosion and discoloration, the tire itself was in remarkably good condition, suggesting it hadn't been buried for the full 5 years since Jake's disappearance. More troubling still, the spokes showed evidence of deliberate damage. Several had been bent or partially severed in a pattern that suggested intentional sabotage rather than accidental impact. As the team carefully excavated the surrounding area, additional discoveries emerged from the sandy soil. A small fragment of orange plastic, possibly from a bike fender. Several bolts that appeared to match the specifications of Jake's KTM 250. And most unnervingly, a section of chain that had been deliberately cut with bolt cutters, the clean edges still visible despite years of burial. Detective Santos documented each item with methodical precision, her camera flash creating stark shadows in the gathering twilight. The pattern of buried components suggested they had been planted deliberately, scattered across a roughly circular area about 15 feet in diameter. Someone had taken considerable time and effort to hide Jake's bike parts in this remote location, far from the main search area that had been combed so thoroughly 5 years earlier. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. If this wheel belonged to Jake's bike, why had it been separated from the rest of the machine? Why bury individual components rather than dispose of the entire bike? And most disturbing of all, why choose this particular location? Isolated enough to avoid casual discovery, but not so remote that it couldn't eventually be found. As darkness fell over the desert, portable lights were erected around the excavation site. The work would continue through the night, each shovelful of sand potentially revealing another piece of the puzzle that had confounded investigators for half a decade. Santos called Tom and Sarah Morrison from the scene, her voice carefully neutral as she explained that evidence possibly related to Jake's disappearance had been discovered. The phone call that Sarah had dreamed about for 5 years finally came, but it brought investigation updates rather than her son's voice. She and Tom drove through the desert night in complete silence, their headlights cutting through darkness that seemed to press against the windshield like a living thing. Neither dared to voice their hopes or fears, but both understood that this discovery marked the end of one chapter in their nightmare and the beginning of another. The excavation revealed 17 separate components from what appeared to be a motorcycle, each item carefully photographed, catalogued, and bagged as evidence. The parts showed consistent patterns of deliberate disassembly, bolts removed with proper tools, components separated cleanly rather than broken by force or impact. Someone with mechanical knowledge had taken Jake's bike apart piece by piece, then scattered those pieces across the desert like breadcrumbs in a twisted fairy tale. But the most significant discovery came just before dawn, when a junior crime scene technician noticed something unusual about the soil composition near the burial site. Mixed in with the native sand and clay were traces of a different kind of earth, darker, richer soil that didn't occur naturally in this part of the desert. Laboratory analysis would later confirm that this foreign soil contained microscopic traces of motor oil and coolant, suggesting it had come from a location where vehicles were regularly maintained or repaired. As the sun rose over the excavation site, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, Detective Santos stood among the evidence markers and tried to make sense of what they'd uncovered. The discovery of Jake's bike parts was significant, but it also meant that someone had known exactly where those parts were buried for the past 5 years. Someone who might still be watching, waiting to see how the investigation would unfold. The wheel that Bobby Carrera had pulled from the desert floor wasn't just evidence, it was a message. And Detective Santos had the uncomfortable feeling that whoever had sent that message wasn't finished communicating. The Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab in Austin resembled a cathedral of science. Its sterile hallways echoing with the soft hum of sophisticated equipment and the measured footsteps of technicians pursuing truth through microscopic evidence. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the lab's chief forensic analyst, had examined thousands of pieces of evidence throughout her 20-year career, but the components from Jake Morrison's motorcycle presented puzzles that challenged even her experienced eye. Under powerful magnification, the wheel's spokes revealed their secrets, like ancient manuscripts yielding to patient translation. The bent metal showed stress patterns consistent with deliberate force applied with precision tools, not the chaotic damage expected from a high-speed crash or violent impact. Someone had systematically weakened specific structural points, creating failure patterns that would have been invisible to casual inspection but potentially catastrophic during high-speed competition. The orange paint fragments told an even more troubling story. Chemical analysis revealed multiple layers of color. The original factory orange beneath, but also traces of black paint that had been carefully applied and then removed. Someone had attempted to disguise Jake's distinctive bike, covering its identifying color with darker pigments before ultimately deciding to strip it back to the original finish. The process had been methodical, professional, suggesting someone with experience in automotive refinishing. Detective Santos paced the observation area outside the lab. Her reflection multiplied in the glass walls that separated her from Dr. Chen's meticulous work. 24 hours had passed since the desert excavation, and each piece of evidence seemed to deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. Her phone had been ringing constantly. Reporters, amateur investigators, and well-meaning citizens all desperate for updates on the case that had captured the public imagination once again. The foreign soil samples proved most revealing under spectroscopic analysis. The dark earth contained traces of synthetic motor oils, transmission fluid, and hydraulic compounds consistent with a professional automotive repair facility. But more intriguingly, the soil also showed microscopic particles of a specific type of sand used in industrial sandblasting operations. Dr. Chen's preliminary assessment suggested the components had been stored in a garage or workshop before their burial in the desert. Tom Morrison sat in the lab's waiting area, his weathered hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Seeing pieces of his son's bike spread across sterile examination tables had triggered a complex mixture of emotions. Hope that answers might finally emerge, but also a crushing realization that Jake's beautiful machine had been reduced to evidence in a criminal investigation. The bike he'd maintained with such loving care, the machine that had represented his son's dreams and aspirations, had become fragments of metal and rubber arranged under harsh fluorescent lights. The chain analysis provided the most concrete timeline yet established. The clean cuts showed no signs of rust or corrosion that would be expected after 5 years of desert exposure. In fact, microscopic examination revealed that the chain had been severed relatively recently, possibly within the past 12 to 18 months. This discovery shattered the assumption that Jake's bike had been dismantled immediately after his disappearance. Dr. Chen discovered additional evidence that someone had been maintaining the bike components even after Jake's disappearance. Several bolts showed fresh tool marks, and the aluminum rim bore traces of recent cleaning compounds. The tire, despite being buried, showed patterns of wear that could only have occurred through actual use on various terrain types. Someone had been riding Jake's bike, keeping it operational, possibly for years after the teenager vanished. The implications were staggering. Jake Morrison hadn't simply disappeared. He'd been taken by someone who had the expertise, equipment, and time to systematically dismantle his bike and hide the evidence across multiple locations and timeframes. The discovery suggested a level of planning and patience that indicated this wasn't a crime of opportunity, but rather a carefully orchestrated operation. Sarah Morrison arrived at the lab just as Dr. Chen was completing her preliminary examination of a small metal fragment that had been overlooked during the initial excavation. Under magnification, The fragment revealed itself to be part of a custom racing throttle, a modification that Tom had installed personally just 2 weeks before Jake's disappearance. The part was distinctive, bearing the unique serial number that Tom had carefully documented in his meticulous maintenance records. But what made this discovery truly unsettling was the condition of the throttle fragment. Unlike the other components, which showed signs of age and exposure, this piece appeared almost new. The metal gleamed with recent polish, and the grip surface bore no wear patterns despite supposedly being buried for years. Someone had either replaced the original throttle with a new one, or they had been maintaining Jake's bike with replacement parts long after his disappearance. Detective Santos reviewed the forensic timeline that was emerging from Dr. Chen's analysis. The evidence suggested that Jake's bike had been taken intact immediately after his disappearance, hidden in a professional garage or workshop, where it had been maintained and possibly ridden for years. Only recently had someone begun dismantling the machine, burying components in a pattern designed to eventually be discovered. The question that haunted everyone involved in the investigation was simple, yet terrifying. If Jake's bike had been preserved and maintained all these years, what had happened to Jake himself? The care shown for the machine suggested someone who understood its value and significance. But machines could be maintained indefinitely, while human beings could not. As the forensic examination continued into the second day, Dr. Chen made a discovery that would redirect the entire investigation. Hidden beneath layers of accumulated grime on the engine block's serial number plate was a small scratch, barely visible to the naked eye, but clearly deliberate under magnification. The scratch formed two initials, MW. The marking hadn't been there when Tom Morrison had last serviced the bike. He was absolutely certain of this fact because he photographed every major component during routine maintenance, a practice that had helped him spot potential problems before they became dangerous failures. The initials had been carved into the metal after Jake's disappearance, possibly as a signature or claim of ownership. Detective Santos felt the familiar tingle of a case beginning to break open. The initials MW might be the first concrete lead they'd uncovered in 5 years of investigation. But as she prepared to launch a search for individuals with those initials, she couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had left that marking had wanted it to be found. The entire pattern of evidence suggested someone who was ready to reveal their secrets, but only on their own terms and according to their own timeline. The forensic trail was becoming clear, but the destination remained shrouded in mystery. Someone had taken Jake Morrison and his bike, maintained both for years in secret, and was now beginning to reveal their crime piece by piece. The question was no longer what had happened to Jake Morrison, but who was controlling the revelation of that information, and why they had chosen this moment to begin telling their story. The initials MW sent Detective Santos down a rabbit hole of database searches and cross-references that consumed 3 sleepless days. Her office had become a war room of printouts, photographs, and timeline charts that covered every available surface. The coffee pot ran continuously, and her answering machine accumulated messages from reporters and curiosity seekers that she ignored with single-minded determination. The breakthrough came not from sophisticated criminal databases, but from Jake Morrison's own social media accounts that Santos had revisited countless times over the years. Buried in the comments section of a racing photo posted just 2 weeks before Jake's disappearance was an exchange that had seemed meaningless 5 years ago, but now blazed with significance. A user named Desert Wolf MX had commented on Jake's riding technique, offering advice about cornering strategy and suspension settings. The conversation had been friendly, technical, and completely normal for the motocross community's online culture. But when Santos ran a reverse search on the username, she discovered that Desert Wolf MX belonged to Marcus Webb, the same race official who had been stationed at Turn 7 when Jake vanished. Webb's sudden departure from Texas, 6 months after Jake's disappearance, had raised questions at the time. But with no evidence of wrongdoing, the investigation had stalled. Now, with physical evidence linking someone with the initials MW to Jake's bike, Webb's flight to New Mexico looked less like coincidence and more like guilty conscience. The New Mexico State Police located Marcus Webb within hours of Santos's request. He was living in a small town called Deming, working as a mechanic at an independent motorcycle shop that specialized in vintage racing bikes. Local law enforcement reported that Webb lived alone in a modest house on the outskirts of town, kept to himself, and had never caused any trouble. His neighbors described him as polite but distant, the kind of man who waved hello but never stopped to chat. But it was Webb's work history that made Santos's pulse quicken. The motorcycle shop where he'd been employed for the past 4 years was owned by a man named Vincent Carlisle, a former professional motocross racer whose career had ended abruptly in the early 2000s following allegations of race fixing and illegal gambling. Carlisle had never been formally charged, but the scandal had effectively blacklisted him from professional racing. Santos coordinated with New Mexico authorities to conduct simultaneous searches of Webb's residence and Carlisle's motorcycle shop. The operation was planned for dawn on a Thursday, when both men would likely be at their respective locations. But when the search teams arrived, they found both properties abandoned, recently evacuated, with personal belongings left behind, but no trace of either Webb or Carlisle. Webb's house told the story of a man living with constant guilt and paranoia. His bedroom walls were covered with newspaper clippings about Jake Morrison's disappearance, racing photos, and what appeared to be a detailed timeline of the investigation's progress over the past 5 years. A locked footlocker in his closet contained racing memorabilia, including several programs from Thunder Valley events and a photograph of Jake Morrison that had been carefully cut from a magazine. More disturbing still was Webb's workshop in the garage behind his house. The space contained sophisticated motorcycle maintenance equipment, tools worth thousands of dollars that seemed inconsistent with a small-town mechanic's salary. Chemical analysis would later confirm that the soil samples contained in several containers matched the foreign earth found at the burial site in Texas. Webb had been storing components from Jake's bike in this workshop, maintaining them with professional-grade equipment. But the most chilling discovery was a handwritten journal hidden beneath Webb's workbench. The entries, dating back 5 years, documented a growing obsession with young motocross riders and detailed plans for what Webb called talent acquisition. The language was clinical, detached, describing teenage riders as assets and investments rather than human beings. One entry, dated 3 weeks after Jake's disappearance, was particularly revealing. Subject adapted well to new environment. Natural talent exceptional as predicted. Training progressing ahead of schedule. Recommend expansion of program to include additional candidates. Detective Santos felt sick as she read. Webb's meticulous documentation of what appeared to be a systematic operation targeting promising young riders. The journal referenced multiple subjects and training facilities, suggesting that Jake Morrison might not have been Webb's only victim. The scope of the operation was far larger than anyone had imagined. Carlisle's motorcycle shop yielded evidence of an even more sophisticated criminal enterprise. Hidden behind a false wall in the workshop was a room containing racing gear in multiple sizes, professional-grade training equipment, and detailed files on dozens of young riders from across the Southwest. The files included performance statistics, family backgrounds, financial situations, and psychological profiles that would have taken months or years to compile. The financial records discovered in Carlisle's office painted a picture of a lucrative underground racing circuit that exploited talented young riders who had been reported missing from their families. Bank statements showed large cash deposits corresponding to what appeared to be racing events, with notations indicating betting odds and payouts. The operation had been generating hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. But Jake Morrison's file was different from the others. While most contained clinical assessments and performance data, Jake's folder included personal items, photos of him with his family, copies of his school transcripts, and even a recording of his voice taken from a television interview after a regional championship. Someone had been studying Jake Morrison with an intensity that went beyond mere criminal opportunity. The investigation team found evidence of at least 12 other missing teenagers whose disappearances matched the pattern of Jake's case. All talented motocross riders, all vanished during races or practice sessions, all from families without significant financial resources to sustain extended searches. The geographic distribution stretched across 4 states and covered a 7-year period. As Santos coordinated with federal authorities to launch a multi-state manhunt, she couldn't escape the feeling that Webb and Carlisle's sudden disappearance wasn't coincidental. Someone had warned them that their operation was about to be exposed. The timing suggested that the buried bike parts hadn't been discovered by accident. They'd been placed specifically to be found, as part of a larger plan that was still unfolding. The connection between Jake Morrison's disappearance and a sophisticated criminal enterprise explained many of the puzzling aspects of the case. The professional dismantling of his bike, the careful burial of components, the maintenance of evidence over years, all pointed to people with resources, expertise, and a long-term plan for exploiting their crimes. But one question remained unanswered. If this operation had been so successful and profitable, why was someone now deliberately exposing it? The evidence suggested that Webb and Carlisle were being betrayed by someone within their own organization, someone who wanted the truth about Jake Morrison to be revealed, but only after 5 years of careful preparation. Detective Santos stared at the crime scene photos spread across her desk and realized that they weren't just investigating a kidnapping anymore. They were unraveling a criminal conspiracy that had destroyed multiple families and generated millions of dollars through the systematic exploitation of missing children. And somewhere in the shadows, the person who had started this revelation was watching to see how far the investigation would go. FBI agent Rachel Martinez had specialized in human trafficking cases for 8 years, but the evidence spread across the conference. Table at the Austin field office represented something she'd never encountered before, a sophisticated network that kidnapped talented teenagers not for traditional exploitation, but to compete in an underground racing circuit that generated millions through illegal gambling. The seized financial records from Carlisle's motorcycle shop revealed a complex money laundering operation that stretched from Texas to Nevada. Bank transfers, coded phone conversations, and encrypted computer files documented a shadow economy built around the stolen dreams of missing children. The betting records showed individual races generating payouts exceeding $500,000, with the most skilled riders commanding appearance fees that rivaled professional athletes. But what made this criminal enterprise particularly insidious was its careful selection criteria. Unlike random kidnappings motivated by ransom demands, this operation specifically targeted riders with exceptional natural talent but limited financial resources. The perpetrators had studied their victims for months, learning their routines, identifying their vulnerabilities, and calculating the likelihood that their disappearances would generate sustained law enforcement attention. Jake Morrison's psychological profile, found among Carlisle's files, provided disturbing insights into how thoroughly the operation had studied its victims. The document detailed Jake's relationship with his parents, his academic performance, his racing ambitions, and even his dietary preferences and sleep patterns. Someone had been watching Jake Morrison for at least 6 months before his disappearance, learning everything necessary to control him once he was taken. The network's infrastructure was impressive in its scope and sophistication. Safe houses across 4 states provided temporary housing for kidnapped riders between racing events. Professional medical staff, recruited from veterinary backgrounds to avoid traditional healthcare oversight, provided injury treatment and performance enhancement. Mechanical crews maintained fleets of high-performance racing bikes using stolen parts and illegal modifications that would never pass official safety inspections. Agent Martinez coordinated with international law enforcement agencies to track financial transactions that suggested the operation extended beyond American borders. Racing events had been held in remote locations across Mexico, with wealthy spectators flying in from around the world to bet on competitions featuring riders who had been reported missing by their families. The global nature of the enterprise explained how it had remained hidden for so long. Detective Santos flew to Las Vegas to interview Dmitry Volkov, a Russian businessman whose arrested associates had provided information about illegal racing circuits in exchange for reduced sentences. Volkov operated from a penthouse suite in a downtown casino, his legitimate businesses serving as fronts for various criminal enterprises. Volkov's revelation chilled Santos to the bone. The missing riders weren't just kidnapped. They were being systematically broken down psychologically, their identities erased, their hope slowly crushed, until they became compliant performers in an underground gladiator arena. The Morrison boy was special, Volkov admitted, his accent thick with vodka and regret. Too much spirit, too much fight, became a problem for the handlers. Agent Martinez pressed for details about Jake's fate, but Volkov's cooperation had limits. He provided locations of 3 racing facilities in Mexico and Nevada, names of key financial backers, and confirmation that the operation was being systematically dismantled by someone from within. But when asked directly about Jake Morrison's current status, Volkov's eyes went cold. "Some problems require permanent solutions," he said quietly. The implications hung in the air like poison gas. After 5 years of hope, of believing Jake might still be alive somewhere, the investigation was pointing toward a conclusion that would destroy what remained of Tom and Sarah Morrison's world. The phone call came at 3:47 a.m., waking Detective Santos from her first decent sleep in a week. The voice was young, male, and trembling with what sounded like equal parts terror and determination. "You're looking for Jake Morrison," the caller whispered. "I can help, but they're watching everything. Meet me at the old Sinclair station on Route 287 tomorrow at midnight. Come alone, or more kids die." The line went dead before Santos could respond, leaving her staring at her phone in the darkness of her bedroom. The caller had known details about the investigation that hadn't been released to the public, specific timeline information, and Jake's middle name, which had been withheld from media reports. 24 hours later, Santos drove through the desert darkness toward the abandoned gas station that had been closed since the interstate bypass was completed in 2015. Her backup units were positioned 2 miles away, close enough to respond quickly, but far enough to avoid spooking a potentially crucial witness. The Sinclair station emerged from the darkness like a ghost, its broken windows and rusted pumps creating eerie shadows in Santos's headlights. A figure stepped out from behind the building, young, maybe 19 or 20, wearing a hooded sweatshirt despite the desert heat. "Detective Santos?" His voice carried the same tremor she'd heard on the phone. "My name is Kevin Chen. I was supposed to disappear 3 years ago, but I escaped." Kevin's story unfolded in broken fragments, interrupted by nervous glances at every shadow and sound. He'd been taken during a practice session in Arizona, drugged and transported to a facility in Mexico where kidnapped riders were held, trained, and forced to compete in underground races. "Jake was there when I arrived," Kevin whispered. "Room next to mine. He never stopped trying to escape, never gave up hope that his parents would find him. The guards called him the problem child because he wouldn't break." Santos felt her heart hammering as Kevin described the facility, a converted ranch compound surrounded by desert, where teenage riders lived in barrack-style buildings and trained on professional-grade tracks. The operation was run with military precision, complete with armed guards, surveillance cameras, and medical staff who kept the riders compliant with carefully administered drugs. "They told us our families had given up looking," Kevin continued. "Said we were dead to the outside world and racing was our only purpose now." Most kids believed it after a while, but not Jake. He kept track of time, remembered dates, talked about going home. The turning point, according to Kevin's account, had come 18 months ago when Jake had organized an escape attempt involving 4 other riders. The plan had failed, but not before Jake had managed to steal detailed records about the operation's finances and locations. "That's when things changed," Kevin said, his voice dropping to barely audible. "They separated Jake from the rest of us, said he was being transferred to a special facility where problem cases were handled differently." Kevin had escaped during the chaos following Jake's disappearance from the main facility, hiking through desert terrain for 2 days before reaching a highway where truckers had helped him contact authorities. But fear of retaliation had kept him silent until the recent news coverage convinced him that law enforcement was finally taking the case seriously. "Jake left something for his parents," Kevin said, pulling a small object from his pocket. "Made me promise to get it to them if I ever got out." He handed Santos a small medallion, a St. Christopher pendant that Tom Morrison had given Jake for his 16th birthday. The silver medal was tarnished and dented, but engraved on the back were coordinates: 31.77755 degree N, 106.216.67 W. "He said those numbers would explain everything," Kevin whispered. "Said his dad would understand what they meant." The coordinates pointed to a location in the Chihuahuan Desert, approximately 40 miles south of the Mexican border. Satellite imagery revealed what appeared to be an abandoned mining operation, but thermal sensors suggested recent activity in several of the buildings. As Kevin prepared to leave, Santos made one final attempt to learn Jake's fate. "Is he alive?" Kevin's silence stretched for almost a minute before he spoke. "Jake Morrison died the day he tried to escape. But the person they created afterward, I don't know if that's living or something worse." The Joint Task Force assembled before dawn on the American side of the border. FBI agents, DEA specialists, and Mexican federal police coordinating an operation that would either rescue survivors or confirm the worst fears about the underground racing network. Agent Martinez had spent 3 sleepless days obtaining international warrants and negotiating jurisdictional protocols that would allow American law enforcement to participate in the raid. Helicopter surveillance of the coordinates Kevin Chen had provided revealed a compound larger and more sophisticated than anyone had anticipated. The abandoned mining operation had been converted into a fully functional racing facility, complete with professional tracks, maintenance workshops, and residential buildings that could house dozens of people. Thermal imaging showed approximately 30 individuals at the facility, with concentrations of activity around what appeared to be a central compound and several outlying structures. Vehicle heat signatures suggested the presence of motorcycles, trucks, and at least 2 aircraft capable of rapid evacuation. The raid began at 5:23 a.m., with coordinated strikes on all access points to prevent escapes while minimizing risk to potential victims. Santos rode with the primary assault team, her bulletproof vest feeling inadequate against the magnitude of what they might discover in the desert compound. The facility's security measures became apparent immediately. Professional-grade cameras, motion sensors, and armed guards who responded to the raid with military precision. The ensuing firefight lasted 11 minutes and resulted in 4 arrests, 2 injuries, and the tragic confirmation that this operation had been far more extensive than even the federal investigation had suggested. Building by building, the task force uncovered the infrastructure of systematic human exploitation. The residential quarters housed 19 teenagers aged 14 to 21, all reported missing from various locations across North America. Medical records found in the compound's clinic documented years of psychological conditioning, performance, enhancement drug regimens, and surgical procedures designed to alter the riders' appearances and identities. But it was the discovery in Building C that stopped Detective Santos in her tracks. A single room, isolated from the others, contained personal belongings that she recognized from crime scene photos taken 5 years earlier. Jake Morrison's racing gloves, his lucky pre-race sandwich container, and photographs of his family arranged on a small table like a shrine. On the wall above the table, scratched into the concrete with what appeared to be a metal tool, were hundreds of tally marks arranged in groups of 7. Santos counted 312 marks, representing days, weeks, or months that someone had been trapped in this room, maintaining their sanity by tracking the passage of time. The compound's records room yielded financial documents that revealed the true scope of the criminal enterprise. Over 7 years, the operation had generated more than $12 million through illegal racing events, with individual competitions drawing spectators willing to pay premium prices to watch kidnapped teenagers compete in life-threatening conditions. But the most disturbing discovery was a video archive containing footage of racing events dating back to the operation's inception. Hours of recorded competitions showed dozens of young riders, their faces hollow with exhaustion and fear, competing on dangerous tracks while wealthy spectators placed bets on their survival. In one video dated 6 months earlier, Santos watched footage that made her hands shake with rage and sorrow. A rider wearing Jake Morrison's number 47 was competing in what appeared to be a desert endurance race, his face obscured by helmet and goggles, but his riding style unmistakably familiar to anyone who had studied Jake's racing techniques. The rider in the video moved with mechanical precision, executing turns and jumps with technical skill, but none of the joy and passion that had characterized Jake Morrison's racing. He competed like someone going through practiced motions, as if the spirit that had once driven him to excel had been systematically destroyed and replaced with mere functionality. Mexican federal agents arrested Vincent Carlisle at the compound, finding him attempting to destroy computer records that documented years of criminal activity. His interrogation revealed that the operation had been unraveling for months, with someone inside the organization systematically exposing their activities to law enforcement. "Someone's been feeding information to the cops," Carlisle admitted during questioning. "Started small, anonymous tips, buried evidence, but it's been escalating. Whoever's doing it knows everything about our operation." The 19 rescued teenagers were transported to medical facilities for evaluation and eventual reunification with their families. But none of them was Jake Morrison, and none claimed to know his current location. They described him as a legendary figure among the kidnapped riders, someone who had never stopped fighting, never accepted his situation, and had become a symbol of resistance within the facility. As the sun set over the raided compound, Detective Santos stood in the empty room where Jake Morrison had apparently been held, studying the tally marks that represented years of captivity and the photographs that had kept him connected to his family. The evidence suggested he had been here recently, but his current location remained unknown. Agent Martinez approached with a final piece of intelligence that would reshape their understanding of the entire investigation. "We found Marcus Webb," she said quietly. "He's been dead for 6 months. Someone executed him and made it look like a drug deal gone wrong." The implication was clear. Someone within the criminal organization had been systematically eliminating key players while simultaneously exposing their operation to law enforcement. Jake Morrison's disappearance had triggered a 5-year game of cat and mouse that was finally reaching its conclusion. But the question remained: was Jake Morrison orchestrating his own rescue, or was someone else using his case to destroy the network that had stolen so many young lives? 3 weeks after the raid, Detective Santos received an encrypted message through a secure law enforcement channel that contained a single sentence: "Jake Morrison is alive, and he wants to meet." The message included coordinates for a location in the Texas desert, approximately 50 miles from where the investigation had begun 5 years earlier. The meeting site was an abandoned truck stop on Old Highway 90, its rusted fuel pumps standing like skeletal sentinels in the endless expanse of desert. Santos arrived at the specified time, midnight, with backup units positioned beyond visual range but ready to respond within minutes. A figure emerged from the shadows behind the truck stop's collapsed main building. He was tall, lean, and moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years maintaining peak physical condition. His face was weathered beyond his years, marked by scars that spoke of violence and survival, but his green eyes were unmistakably those of Jake Morrison. "Detective Santos," he said, his voice carrying an adult authority that had replaced the teenager's excitement she remembered from old interview footage. "Thank you for coming alone." Jake Morrison, at 22, bore little resemblance to the confident 17-year-old who had disappeared from Thunder Valley Speedway. His hair was darker, his build more muscular, and his entire demeanor radiated the hypervigilant awareness of someone who had lived in constant danger. But most startling was the network of surgical scars visible on his hands and forearms, evidence of medical procedures that had altered his appearance and presumably his fingerprints. "I've been watching the investigation," Jake continued, "guiding it when necessary, the bike parts, the financial records, even Kevin Chen's escape. I orchestrated all of it to bring down the network that destroyed so many lives." Santos struggled to process what she was hearing. The young man standing before her had spent 5 years as a prisoner, but he spoke with the calculated precision of someone who had been planning revenge with methodical patience. Jake explained that his failed escape attempt 3 years earlier had been deliberately staged. He had allowed himself to be transferred to the special facility, a more secure compound where the network's leadership conducted their most sensitive operations. His apparent compliance had been carefully calculated to gain access to financial records, communication systems, and operational details that would ultimately destroy the entire organization. "They thought they had broken me," Jake said, a bitter smile crossing his scarred features. "They were wrong. They just taught me how to think like them." The revelation that Jake had been orchestrating the investigation's breakthroughs was both inspiring and troubling. His 5-year plan had required sacrificing other potential victims, allowing the network to continue operating while he gathered evidence and positioned himself to take it down from within. 18 kids have been rescued because of what I set in motion," Jake said, when Santos questioned his methods. "That's 18 families who got their children back. The math is ugly, but it's the only math that worked." Jake revealed that he had been the anonymous source feeding information to various law enforcement agencies for the past year. His access to the network's inner workings had allowed him to time his revelations perfectly, building a case that would ultimately prosecute everyone involved while protecting the identities of rescued victims. But his most shocking revelation concerned his parents. For 5 years, Tom and Sarah Morrison had grieved for a son they believed might be dead. Jake had watched their pain from afar, accessing news reports and social media posts that documented their suffering, but he had been unable to contact them without compromising his mission. "I wrote them letters every day," Jake said, his voice breaking slightly for the first time during their conversation. "Letters I could never send. Letters explaining why I couldn't come home, why I had to stay and finish what they started." Santos asked the question that had haunted her throughout the investigation. "Why reveal himself now?" "Because it's finished," Jake replied. "The network is destroyed. The leadership is dead or in custody, and the rescued kids are getting the help they need. But mostly because I'm dying." The medical procedures that had altered Jake's appearance had come with a terrible cost. The underground network's doctors had used experimental drugs and surgical techniques that were causing progressive organ failure. Jake's kidneys were failing, his liver was damaged beyond repair, and he had perhaps 6 months left to live. "I wanted my parents to know the truth before I die," he said simply. "I wanted them to know that their son never gave up, never stopped fighting, and that he used everything they taught him to save other kids from the same fate." Jake handed Santos a thick envelope containing letters, photographs, and detailed accounts of his experiences that would help prosecute any remaining network members. But more importantly, it contained a final letter to his parents, an explanation of his 5-year absence and a declaration of love that had sustained him through years of captivity. As Jake prepared to disappear again, this time to spend his remaining months in a secure medical facility where his identity could be protected, Santos made one final plea. "Come home," she said. "Let your parents see you, hold you, say goodbye properly." Jake Morrison looked toward the distant lights of the town where he had grown up, where his parents still lived in the house where his racing trophies gathered dust in his unchanged bedroom. "Detective," he said quietly, "I died in that desert 5 years ago. The person standing here is just someone who looks like their son. They deserve to remember Jake Morrison as he was, not as what he became." He walked back into the shadows, leaving Santos standing alone beside her patrol car with an envelope containing the most extraordinary story of survival, sacrifice, and revenge she had ever encountered. The Jake Morrison case was finally solved, but the solution was more heartbreaking than any mystery. Detective Santos sat in her car for an hour after Jake Morrison vanished back into the desert darkness, staring at the envelope that contained 5 years' worth of anguish, determination, and sacrifice. The weight of his story pressed against her chest like a physical burden. How do you tell parents that their son had been alive all this time, orchestrating his own rescue mission while they grieved his loss? The drive back to town gave her time to process Jake's revelation and prepare for the most difficult conversation of her career. Tom and Sarah Morrison deserved the truth. But Santos knew that truth would fundamentally alter how they understood their son's disappearance and their own suffering during the years he'd been gone. She called the Morrisons at dawn, asking them to meet her at the police station rather than delivering this news in their home. Something this momentous required neutral ground, official witnesses, and immediate access to support services that would help them process what they were about to learn. Tom and Sarah Morrison entered the station conference room looking like people who had been preparing for bad news for so long that hope had become a dangerous luxury. 5 years of disappointment had taught them to expect the worst, while secretly praying for miracles they no longer believed possible. "We found Jake," Santos began, watching their faces transform from resigned acceptance to desperate hope to confusion as she continued. "He's alive, but the story is more complicated than anything we could have imagined." For the next 2 hours, Santos walked the Morrisons through Jake's 5-year journey, his kidnapping, his captivity, his transformation from victim to orchestrator of the network's destruction. She showed them photographs from the raided compound, played audio recordings of Jake's testimony, and explained how their son had sacrificed his own freedom to save other families from enduring what they had experienced. Sarah Morrison's reaction was pure maternal instinct. She wanted to see her son immediately, regardless of his condition or appearance. The knowledge that Jake was alive somewhere, even if he was dying, activated protective impulses that had been dormant during the years of uncertainty. Tom Morrison's response was more complex. As a father, he felt overwhelming pride that his son had shown such courage and determination. As a man who had spent 5 years believing himself a failure for not protecting his child, he struggled with the revelation that Jake had been protecting others while his parents grieved. "He's coming home," Sarah said with fierce determination. "I don't care what he looks like or what he's been through. He's our son, and he's coming home." But Jake Morrison had anticipated his parents' reaction. The envelope contained detailed instructions for his medical care, legal protection, and a final request that they respect his decision to remain in hiding until his death. He had included recent photographs showing the extent of his physical transformation, hoping to help them understand why a reunion might be more traumatic than healing. Santos shared Jake's concern about the psychological impact of seeing what he had become. The young man in the photographs bore scars that told stories of violence, medical experimentation, and survival at costs that would be difficult for parents to witness. His face, while still recognizably Jake, showed the hardened features of someone who had been forced to become someone else entirely. The medical reports Jake had provided painted a grim picture of his prognosis. The experimental drugs and surgical procedures had caused systemic damage that was irreversible. He had perhaps 4 to 6 months of life remaining, and those months would likely involve increasing pain and deterioration that would be agonizing for his family to watch. But Sarah Morrison had endured 5 years of not knowing, and she refused to spend Jake's final months wondering what he looked like or whether he remembered their love. She demanded to see her son. Consequences be damned. "I've been his mother for 22 years, she said, tears streaming down her face. "I held him when he had nightmares, bandaged his scrapes, cheered at his races. I'm not going to let him die alone because he's worried about protecting my feelings." Tom Morrison struggled with conflicting emotions: respect for his son's wishes, desperate desire for reunion, and overwhelming guilt about the years Jake had spent planning revenge while his parents rebuilt their lives around his absence. The knowledge that Jake had been watching them, protecting them from afar, felt both comforting and devastating. Detective Santos had one final piece of information that would influence the family's decision. Jake had been monitoring his parents' activities, and he knew about Sarah's volunteer work with missing children's families and Tom's quiet efforts to maintain Jake's bedroom exactly as he'd left it. He understood their grief, their love, and their need for closure. "He left this decision up to you," Santos explained. "If you insist on seeing him, he'll agree to a meeting. But he wanted you to make that choice with full knowledge of what you'd be seeing, and why he thought separation might be kinder." The room fell silent as Tom and Sarah Morrison contemplated a decision that would define how they spent their son's final months. After 5 years of questions, they finally had answers. But those answers came with choices that were almost as difficult as the original mystery. Sarah Morrison looked at her husband, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. "We want to see our son," she said quietly. "Whatever he looks like, whatever he's become, he's still Jake, and we're still his parents. We've lost 5 years already. We're not losing whatever time is left." Detective Santos nodded and reached for her phone to begin arranging the most extraordinary reunion in her career, a meeting between parents and a son who had become something between hero and ghost, victim and avenger, the boy they remembered, and the man he'd been forced to become. The safe house outside Austin looked like countless other suburban homes: beige siding, manicured lawn, and the kind of anonymous architecture designed to attract no attention. But inside, federal marshals maintained security protocols that protected one of the most important witnesses in a multinational criminal case, a young man whose very existence was still classified information. Jake Morrison sat in the living room, wearing civilian clothes that couldn't quite disguise the physical transformation 5 years had wrought. His hands shook slightly as he arranged and rearranged the items he'd prepared for his parents. Letters he'd written but never sent, photographs from his childhood they'd never seen, and a small wooden carving he'd made during the endless hours of captivity. Detective Santos arrived first, followed by a medical team that would monitor Jake's condition during what promised to be an emotionally devastating reunion. The young man's kidney function had deteriorated noticeably in the weeks since their desert meeting, and doctors wanted to ensure the stress of seeing his parents wouldn't accelerate his decline. At precisely 2 p.m., a black SUV pulled into the driveway. Tom Morrison emerged first, his movements stiff with nervous energy, followed by Sarah, whose face showed the determined composure of a mother preparing to see her child after 5 years of separation. The moment Sarah Morrison saw her son through the living room window, her careful emotional control shattered completely. The boy who had left for the race that morning in 2018 had been replaced by a man whose body bore the evidence of years that no parent should ever have to imagine their child enduring. Jake stood as his parents entered the room, and for a moment that felt like an eternity. The three of them simply stared at each other across a gulf of time and experience that seemed almost impossible to bridge. "Mom," Jake said softly, and Sarah Morrison crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling her son into an embrace that was fierce enough to make up for years of missed hugs. Tom Morrison joined the embrace more slowly, his weathered hands touching his son's face as if confirming that this reunion was real and not another dream that had tormented his sleep for 5 years. "You're so thin," Sarah whispered, her maternal instincts immediately cataloging the ways her son's body showed the cost of his ordeal. "Have you been eating enough? Are they taking care of you properly?" Jake smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness Detective Santos had seen from him. "I'm okay, Mom. I'm okay now." The conversation that followed was a careful dance between Jake's desire to protect his parents from the worst, details of his captivity and their need to understand what had happened to their child. He shared stories of maintaining hope by thinking about family dinners, racing memories, and the life he planned to return to someday. Tom Morrison listened as Jake described the mechanical skills that had kept him valuable to his captors, the same knowledge Tom had patiently taught him in their garage during countless hours of bike maintenance. Those lessons had literally kept Jake alive, providing expertise that made him too useful to dispose of immediately. "You saved me, Dad," Jake said quietly. "Every tool you showed me how to use, every problem you taught me to solve, it all mattered. It all helped me survive and eventually fight back." The family shared photographs and memories, with Jake describing how thoughts of his parents had sustained him during the darkest periods of captivity. He'd maintained detailed mental records of birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays, celebrating them in solitude while planning for the day he might share those memories with his family. But Jake also shared the burden of his decision to remain hidden while orchestrating the network's destruction. He explained the impossible mathematics of his situation, the knowledge that revealing himself earlier would have compromised investigations that ultimately saved other families from experiencing what the Morrisons had endured. "I watched you on the news," he told his parents. "Saw Mom working with other families, helping them navigate what we were going through. Dad maintaining my room, keeping my bikes in perfect condition like I might come home any day. You never gave up, and that gave me strength to keep fighting." As the afternoon progressed, Jake's physical condition became more apparent. He tired easily, requiring frequent breaks and medication that spoke to the serious nature of his medical situation. But he also displayed moments of his old personality, flashes of humor, passionate descriptions of racing techniques, and the deep intelligence that had allowed him to outmaneuver sophisticated criminals. The reunion lasted 4 hours, with Jake sharing as much as his health would allow, and his parents absorbing every detail with the desperate intensity of people trying to compress years of missed conversations into a single afternoon. As evening approached, the inevitable question arose: what happened next? Jake's condition precluded any possibility of returning to his childhood home. The federal protection program required continued security protocols, and his medical needs demanded specialized care that only certain facilities could provide. But for the first time in 5 years, the Morrison family was complete. They were changed, scarred, and facing an uncertain future, but they were together. "I need you to know something," Jake told his parents, as the visit drew to a close. "Everything I did, every choice I made, I did it knowing you raised me to fight for what's right, even when it costs everything. You taught me that some things are worth any price." Sarah Morrison held her son's hand as medical staff prepared for his return to the secure facility where he would spend his remaining time. "We're proud of you," she whispered. "Proud and heartbroken and grateful all at once. You saved those other families, but you also saved us from never knowing the truth." Tom Morrison embraced his son one final time, whispering words that only Jake could hear. A father's blessing, a man's respect, and a promise that Jake Morrison's courage would be remembered long after his body surrendered to the damage inflicted by his captivity. The black SUV pulled away from the safe house as sunset painted the Texas sky in shades of orange that reminded everyone of Jake's racing colors. The Morrison family had found their son, but they had also learned that some victories come at prices too high to calculate and too precious to regret. Jake Morrison died on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 6 months after Detective Santos had first encountered him in the desert. The hospice facility overlooking Lake Austin provided a peaceful setting that contrasted sharply with the violence and chaos that had defined his final years. Sarah Morrison held his hand as he passed, while Tom sat quietly nearby, maintaining the same vigil they'd kept for 3 weeks, as their son's body finally surrendered to damage that no amount of courage could overcome. The obituary, published in newspapers across Texas, told only part of Jake Morrison's story. It mentioned his racing achievements, his disappearance at 17, and his work helping law enforcement solve cases involving missing children. But it couldn't capture the full scope of his sacrifice or the price paid by a family that had endured 2 separate kinds of loss. First believing their son was dead, then knowing he was dying. The funeral drew attendees from across the country. Families of rescued teenagers traveled from as far as California and New York to pay respects to the young man whose suffering had ultimately saved their children. Kevin Chen, the escaped rider who had provided crucial testimony, served as a pallbearer alongside Tom Morrison's brothers and Jake's former racing teammates. But the most moving tribute came from an unexpected source. FBI agent Martinez revealed that Jake had requested a final investigation in his last weeks, a comprehensive audit to ensure no members of the criminal network remained active. His dying wish was that his sacrifice would mark the definitive end of an operation that had destroyed so many young lives. Detective Santos delivered a eulogy that attempted to capture the complexity of Jake Morrison's final years. She described a teenager who had been transformed by circumstances beyond his control into someone who used every tool at his disposal: intelligence, patience, mechanical skill, and sheer determination to ensure other families wouldn't endure what his parents had experienced. Jake Morrison competed in his final race not on a track in front of cheering crowds, but in shadows and silence, against opponents who had stolen years from dozens of young lives, Santos said. He won that race, though the victory cost him everything he might have been. The investigation's final report, declassified following Jake's death, revealed the full scope of his 5-year operation from within the criminal network. His careful documentation had resulted in 47 arrests across 4 countries, the rescue of 23 kidnapped teenagers, and the recovery of millions of dollars that were returned to victims' families. But perhaps Jake's most significant achievement was the destruction of the network's ability to continue operating. His systematic exposure of financial records, operational procedures, and key personnel had made it impossible for the organization to reconstitute itself under new leadership. Sarah Morrison channeled her grief into expanding her volunteer work with missing children's organizations, using Jake's story to educate families about the sophisticated nature of modern trafficking operations. She became a national advocate for improved investigation techniques and interagency cooperation that might prevent other children from experiencing her son's fate. Tom Morrison returned to work at the auto plant, but he also began teaching motorcycle maintenance at the local community college. His classes always included a unit on safety and awareness, teaching young riders to recognize potential threats and protect themselves from predators who targeted the motocross community. The Thunder Valley Speedway installed a memorial to Jake Morrison at Turn 7, the location where he had vanished 5 years earlier. The bronze plaque bore his racing number, his dates, and a simple inscription: "He never stopped racing toward home." Dr. Chen's final forensic report on Jake's case became a textbook example of how physical evidence could tell complex stories across multiple years and locations. Her analysis of the buried bike parts, the soil samples, and the timeline of evidence placement provided a masterclass in criminal investigation that would be studied by law enforcement academies for decades. The Mexican facility where Jake had been held was demolished 6 months after the raid, but not before investigators conducted a comprehensive archaeological survey that documented the scope of the operation and preserved evidence for ongoing prosecutions. The site became a memorial garden where families of rescued children planted trees in honor of those who hadn't survived their captivity. In her final report on the case, Detective Santos reflected on the lessons learned from Jake Morrison's disappearance and the investigation that followed. She emphasized the importance of persistent investigation, interagency cooperation, and the recognition that missing children cases might involve sophisticated criminal networks operating across international boundaries. Jake Morrison's case taught us that victims can become heroes, but at costs that no family should ever have to pay, Santos wrote. His courage saved lives, but it also demonstrated how criminal networks exploit the very qualities we most admire in young people: talent, determination, and dreams of success. The case files were sealed for 25 years to protect ongoing investigations and the identities of rescued victims who were rebuilding their lives under new identities. But Jake's story became part of law enforcement training programs, teaching investigators to look beyond obvious explanations and consider the possibility that missing persons cases might be connected to larger criminal enterprises. 1 year after Jake's death, Tom Morrison received a package with no return address. Inside was a letter from Kevin Chen, now studying engineering at a university in Colorado, and a small trophy, a racing award that Jake had won during his captivity, carved from wood in secret and hidden until Kevin's escape. "He talked about you every day," Kevin wrote. Said his dad had taught him that some races are worth winning no matter what they cost. He never stopped believing he'd make you proud. The Jake Morrison Foundation, established by his parents using settlement money from civil suits against the criminal network, provided support for families of missing children and funded research into trafficking prevention. Sarah Morrison often spoke at conferences, sharing her family's story and advocating for policy changes that might prevent other children from disappearing into shadows. On quiet evenings, Tom Morrison would sit in their garage, the same space where he'd taught Jake to maintain racing bikes with precision and care. The tools hung in perfect order on their pegboard, exactly as Jake had left them before his final race. Sometimes Tom could almost hear his son's voice asking questions about carburetor adjustments or suspension settings, eager to learn everything his father could teach him. The orange KTM 250 that Jake had ridden to Thunder Valley that last Saturday remained in the garage, restored to perfect condition but never started. It served as a monument to dreams interrupted, talent destroyed, and a young man's determination to ensure his suffering would have meaning. Detective Santos kept one piece of evidence from the case: the St. Christopher pendant that Kevin Chen had carried out of captivity, the medal that had led investigators to the coordinates where Jake had been held. She wore it as a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can illuminate the darkest places. As years passed, Jake Morrison's story became legend in the motocross community, a cautionary tale about the dangers that could lurk beneath the surface of competitive sports, but also an inspiration about the power of human determination to overcome unimaginable circumstances. But for Tom and Sarah Morrison, Jake would always be the 17-year-old boy who had kissed his mother goodbye that Saturday morning, confident and excited about his chances in the race that would define his future. They chose to remember him that way, not as the scarred young man who had emerged from 5 years of captivity, but as their son whose courage had saved other families from enduring the same loss. The final entry in Jake Morrison's journal, written just days before his death, contained a message for his parents. "I never stopped racing toward home. Every day, every decision, every sacrifice. It was all about finding my way back to you. I hope you understand that coming home isn't just about a place. It's about making sure the people you love can sleep safely. knowing someone fought for them. In the end, Jake Morrison had won his final race, not by crossing a finish line, but by ensuring that the network that had destroyed his life could never steal another child's future. It was a victory measured not in trophies or prize money, but in families that would never experience the 5-year nightmare that had defined the Morrison household. The desert where Jake had vanished kept its new secrets. The location of his memorial service, attended only by family and the investigators who had worked tirelessly to bring him home. As the sun set over the Texas landscape, painting the sky in shades of orange that would forever remind them of racing colors, the Morrison family finally found the peace that had eluded them for so many years. Jake Morrison was home at last. 5 years after Jake Morrison's death, Detective Santos stood before a classroom of FBI Academy trainees, holding up a photograph of a 17-year-old boy with bright green eyes and an infectious smile. The case that had defined her career had become required study material for federal investigators, a masterclass in persistence, interagency cooperation, and the recognition that missing persons cases could hide sophisticated criminal enterprises. Jake Morrison disappeared on a Saturday afternoon in front of 15,000 witnesses, she began, the same way she'd started this lecture dozens of times. His case taught us that sometimes the most public crimes can hide the most elaborate conspiracies. The Jake Morrison Protocols, now standard procedure for missing persons investigations involving talented young athletes, had prevented at least 12 additional kidnappings according to FBI statistics. Law enforcement agencies monitored racing events, athletic competitions, and talent showcases with new awareness of how predators identified and stalked potential victims. Sarah Morrison, now 53, had become one of the country's most effective advocates for missing children's families. Her testimony before congressional committees had resulted in increased funding for cold case investigations and improved coordination between local and federal agencies. She spoke with the authority of someone who had lived through every parent's worst nightmare and emerged with hard-earned wisdom about survival and hope. The Morrison Foundation had grown into a national organization providing support services, investigative resources, and educational programs that reached hundreds of families annually. Sarah's office wall displayed photographs of reunited families, children who had been found, cases that had been solved, and parents who had received answers they thought they'd never get. Tom Morrison had found his own way to honor his son's memory. His motorcycle maintenance classes at the community college had evolved into a comprehensive safety program that educated young riders about recognizing potential threats. He taught hundreds of teenagers the same skills Jake had used to survive, emphasizing that mechanical knowledge could be both passion and protection. The garage where Jake had learned to work on motorcycles had been converted into a classroom, its walls lined with safety equipment and educational materials that might prevent other children from experiencing his fate. Tom's students learned not just about engines and suspension, but about awareness, communication, and the importance of never traveling alone to unfamiliar racing venues. Kevin Chen, now 26, and working as a mechanical engineer for a major motorcycle manufacturer, had used his experiences to develop safety technologies that protected riders from both mechanical failures and human predators. His innovations included GPS tracking systems, emergency communication devices, and tamper-evident security features that had become standard equipment on racing bikes. Kevin visited the Morrison family every year on the anniversary of Jake's death, sharing memories of his friend's courage and the quiet leadership he had provided to other kidnapped riders. These visits had become healing rituals for everyone involved, opportunities to remember Jake not as a victim, but as someone who had transformed his suffering into salvation for others. The Thunder Valley Speedway Memorial had grown into a pilgrimage site for racing families who wanted to honor Jake's memory and remember their own children safely. The bronze plaque at Turn 7 was surrounded by flowers, racing memorabilia, and letters from young riders who had been inspired by Jake's story to pursue their dreams while remaining vigilant about their safety. Dr. Chen's forensic techniques, developed during the Morrison investigation, had been applied to dozens of other cases involving sophisticated criminal networks. Her methodical approach to analyzing physical evidence across multiple timeframes and locations had become known as the Morrison method, taught in forensic science programs worldwide. The international task force that had emerged from Jake's case continued operating under expanded mandates, investigating trafficking networks that exploited talented children in various fields. Athletes, musicians, artists, and performers, any young person with exceptional abilities, were now recognized as potential targets for sophisticated criminal enterprises. But perhaps Jake Morrison's most important legacy was the understanding that victims could become heroes without losing their humanity. His story demonstrated that courage could manifest in many forms, not just the dramatic gestures that captured headlines, but the quiet persistence required to gather evidence, build cases, and protect others from experiencing similar harm. Agent Martinez, now heading the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit, often reflected on how Jake's case had changed her understanding of heroism. In her experience, the most effective heroes were often people who had suffered tremendously, but channeled that suffering into protecting others from similar experiences. The sealed case files would eventually be opened, providing researchers and historians with detailed documentation of how one teenager's courage had dismantled an international criminal network. But the true measure of Jake Morrison's impact would be found in the families who never experienced the Morrison family's 5-year nightmare because of lessons learned from his sacrifice. Detective Santos concluded her lecture the same way every time, with a challenge that had become central to modern missing persons investigations. Jake Morrison's case reminds us that every missing child deserves the same level of investigation, the same commitment to finding answers, and the same recognition that their disappearance might be connected to something larger and more dangerous than we initially understood. As the Academy trainees filed out of the classroom, Santos remained behind, studying the photograph of Jake Morrison that had started her presentation. The boy in the picture had no idea that his racing dreams would lead to 5 years of captivity and a death at 22. But he also couldn't have known that his courage would save dozens of other young lives and revolutionize how law enforcement approached missing children cases. In the end, Jake Morrison had won the most important race of all, the race against time, despair, and the forces that sought to make him disappear without meaning or memory. His legacy lived on in every rescued child, every solved case, and every family that found answers they thought they'd never receive. The desert wind still blows across Thunder Valley Speedway on race days, carrying the sound of engines and the dreams of young riders who understand that talent brings both opportunity and risk. They race with awareness now, protected by protocols developed through one teenager's ultimate sacrifice, competing under the watchful eyes of officials trained to recognize the predators who once moved freely through their community. If this story left you as impacted as it did me, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment your opinion below. Each comment is like a new piece that can help unravel other mysteries like this one. Jake Morrison's story reminds us that sometimes the most important victories are won not on racetracks or in competition, but in the shadows where heroes emerge from the most unlikely circumstances to ensure that others never have to endure what they've survived. The wheel that changed everything had revealed not just a crime, but a young man's extraordinary determination to transform his darkest experience into light for others, lost in similar darkness.